welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, November 1st, actually, around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about all of the big-time games down the stretch for all the conference and CFP races. Going to be a huge amount of games that I want to break down for you guys today around each conference, so definitely want to get to that first. Then we'll get to a couple of players and coaches under the most pressure as they head into this huge Week 10. Definitely a lot of coaches out there that are under a ton of pressure, including those two up in State College, Pennsylvania. Then we'll get into a little bit of Week 9 whip around, Week 10 whip around. We'll get to all the games we hadn't had a chance to get to thus far throughout the week, including Tulane's huge win yesterday. Then we'll get into all my best bets for the upcoming weekend. Definitely a lot of overs on here, and I'll try to, hopefully, we'll get some points this upcoming weekend. Then we'll get into a couple of talks around the injuries and the headline updates from this past weekend. Definitely a lot that has gone on, and definitely want to get you guys fully updated, including that Georgia-Florida game, the one going on this weekend, getting a little bit of a move for the time being. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat feature. Use that $ at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can ask any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive, especially as we head down the home stretch of the season. It's going to be absolutely insane, and definitely want you guys to have as much say in the show as you possibly can. But before we do, also gsmcpodcast.net is up and running, does the exact same thing, so either one of those you'd like to use, please do, and definitely make this just a little bit more interactive. But let's get into those games. Let's get into the November games that are going to be a part of the CFP race, because there's quite a few of them. I have about 3 per conference that I think are going to be huge for this year, and we'll start over in the SEC because there's a ton in the SEC, frankly. There's a number that I left off this list, but I do think it's going to be really interesting to watch. And I'll be honest, this was supposed to be a segment about just tiebreakers and breaking down all the different scenarios and what team would win and what team, how the tiebreakers would all shake out. The issue with that is it comes down to the winning percentage of your common opponents or your winning percentage of your conference opponents overall. We don't know what that's going to be yet. It's very, very hard to get a beat on that, especially with a month that I think is going to get a little bit off the rails. So hopefully we'll be able to figure that out in a couple of weeks. But as of right now, it's still too much football to play to be fully confident, at least, that we know what's going to happen in these races. But the game I'm keying on probably the most in the SEC, frankly, is Alabama at LSU. This is an elimination game. I feel very, very good about that. I do think, there's a mathematical world where a 9-3 Alabama or a 9-3 LSU could get in. I don't think it's a very real world. I don't think it's probably going to happen. And I do think they're probably out of the conference race as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with this one. But I have to assume whoever loses this game is not going to be in the playoff at the end of the year, is not going to be in the conversation for the SEC title down the stretch. Then you got Tennessee at Georgia. I thought about putting Georgia at Ole Miss here. I went Tennessee's direction just because Tennessee has 1 loss. Ole Miss does have 2. But I do think this is going to be a really interesting one. I do think the loser is out of the race for the SEC. The loser is out of the race for the SEC, but the loser is not out of the race for the CFP. That's what I was looking for, finally found it. But this is going to be a really interesting game and could be one where you're going to have a lot of 10-2 teams in the SEC. It could be that whoever loses this one is on the outside looking in, because Tennessee has a win over Alabama. If Alabama goes down to LSU, they no longer have that argument. If Georgia beats Tennessee or loses to Tennessee, but then Alabama beats LSU, they have the tiebreaker over them. So it's very confusing kind of road that we're going to go down here. But this is a game where if you lose it, you're officially at the very least on a knife's edge when it comes to the CFP race. And then this one of the games that I am most excited for. I've been excited for it pretty much since Texas announced that they were going to the SEC, but this is a huge one. This is regardless of the CFP. This is a huge one for about everyone in the state of Texas, but for the CFP, we still have quite a ways to go. Texas has got to get through Florida, at Arkansas, Kentucky before they get there. A&M's got to get through, I believe, South Carolina this weekend, Auburn, as well as New Mexico State. So still have some work to do here, but this could be 2 teams that are not undefeated in conference, but playing for a spot in the SEC title. There is a weird path where A&M could lose this game and still get there, but again, that's something that we'll handle a little bit down the road as we get a little bit deeper into conference play. And then we got a team to watch for all the tiebreakers. We'll do this for every conference, but Florida is the team to watch. They're going to play Georgia, Texas, LSU, and Ole Miss ahead. As we understand, it's a crazy schedule. They lost to A&M by 13 and Tennessee by 6 earlier in the season. I think it is one of those things where if Florida were to beat one of these teams, they would immediately be in a tough spot against some of the other teams that Florida lost to. It is kind of confusing to get a beat on this, but regardless, Florida is a team to watch for all of these kind of matchup on matchup because the CFP will be using that when they get into that room. Then you got Ohio State, Penn State this upcoming weekend in the Big Ten, a huge one, no doubt about that. And this one has a lot more to do with the head coaches, which we'll get to in the next segment, than it has to do with really anything else. But definitely one that if you lose it, you're definitely on out of the Big Ten championship. Penn State technically could still get in, but I'd be very surprised. And then if you win it, you're firmly on your way possibly to a Big Ten title and then maybe to a CFP. And then you got Indiana at Ohio State. This is a huge one in a couple of weeks. Obviously, some work to get there. Indiana's got to get through Michigan State this upcoming weekend, but it could be a world where you have an 11-0 or a 10-0 Indiana team going up against a 9-1 Ohio State team. And it could be that if Indiana loses, they might get left out. An 11-1 Indiana that doesn't have those huge wins might be a team on the chopping block. So definitely something to watch there. Then you got Oregon at Wisconsin on November 16th, a huge one. Oregon should be favored in every game the rest of the way. No doubt about that. They got a huge one this weekend against Michigan, but I do think Wisconsin is a very, very interesting one to watch and definitely could shake up this race just a little bit. So in the Big Ten, where you don't necessarily have a huge amount of marquee games down the stretch, this is one that I would watch for sure. And then the tiebreaker team to me is Maryland. They've faced Oregon and Penn State, or they will going forward, and they've already lost to Indiana by 14 points, something that I almost guarantee you will be brought up in the CFP room if Oregon can only beat them by 3 or if Penn State can only beat them by 1, and then Indiana's over there sitting with a 14-point win over this team. Then you got the Big 12. Texas Tech at Iowa State this upcoming weekend is huge. It's one of those games where Texas Tech falls. They're officially out of contention for the Big 12 for the CFP. Iowa State falls, and they're really they're in even footing at the very least with Colorado and Kansas State, with Kansas State at the very end of the year. They could still salvage this, no doubt about it, but definitely one that Texas Tech needs if they want to stay in. And Iowa State, it would put you in a really, really tough spot for the CFP, that is for sure. Then you got Colorado at Texas Tech. If Texas Tech were to win, they'd be inviting Colorado into town for another spot to possibly stay alive in the Big 12 race. And then Colorado's got to win out. They got to get a little bit of help here and there to find their way into the conference title game. But this is definitely one of those games that I do think could, at the very least, clear someone out. You know, if Texas Tech were to win this weekend, the loser of this game would be officially out of the Big 12 chase and out of the CFP race. Obviously. And then at the end of the year, we got Kansas State at Iowa State. I cannot wait for this one. This one is so much fun and definitely could be just an outright play-in game for who plays BYU in Arlington, because if all of those teams handle business the rest of the way, that's exactly what it'll be. Whoever wins this game will go to that Big 12 title game, and whoever loses will be sitting on their couch and probably watching the CFP from their basement or whatever. The tiebreaker team for me is Houston. I do think they're a team to watch as we head down the stretch. They lost to Iowa State by 20 earlier this year, plays KSU and BYU down the stretch. So definitely something to watch as we get into this, and definitely could be the difference when you come down to conference championship time. And then you got the ACC. Pittsburgh at SMU is a huge one, no doubt about it. I do think this will eliminate one of these teams, particularly SMU. If they were to lose, it would take them to 2 losses on the year, only give them 1 loss in conference, but would put them in a very weird spot moving forward. And then for Pitt, if you were to lose this game, you could still knock out Clemson, and you would have a very, very confusing world ahead of you in the ACC. It's one of those conferences that's very hard to get a beat on, and I know Anthony asked a question yesterday about what would happen if Miami, SMU, and Clemson went undefeated. Still kind of up in the air. It looks like it would be Clemson and Miami, but still one of those things that we're going to have to watch down the stretch, and definitely could switch up before that last weekend. We just talked about this one. Clemson at Pitt is a huge one in a couple of weeks, and it's definitely one where if Pitt were to lose Saturday, it's a pure elimination game from the CFP and the ACC race, because Clemson would go 10-2 or would be at 2 losses at the very least. Pitt would be at 2 losses for sure, and they would be at 2 losses in the ACC. Clemson would just be in a weird spot. If they were to lose to Pitt, especially if Pitt were to lose this upcoming weekend, they'd be behind Pitt, they'd be behind SMU, and obviously they'd be behind Miami as long as Miami handled business. And then we got Clemson at Virginia Tech. I think this is a really interesting one. Clemson's trying to go undefeated the rest of the way. Virginia Tech, if they win this weekend, they would be in the hunt. They would be in the hunt to possibly make a run at the ACC title. Now, they definitely need a couple of things to go their way. I do think they need to beat Clemson. I think they need Clemson to beat Pitt. I think they might need SMU to beat Pitt. It would be very, very confusing up there at the top, but they have the ability to somehow get back in this fight, and getting this one at home could be the difference. It's going to be a huge one for them, and definitely one that you're going to want to tune into. As for Miami, they pretty much should ride out the rest of the way. They do have a game against Georgia Tech that's interesting to watch, and definitely a couple others, but at the end of the day, Miami is the one that's firmly in the driver's seat here because they don't play Pitt, they don't play SMU, they don't play Clemson. They should be able to run the table and then have everyone else just kind of beat each other up. Let's say SMU were to win this weekend, or let's just say Pitt were to win this weekend and then lose to Clemson. Becomes pretty easy. It's Clemson and Miami. If, SMU were to win this weekend and then Pitt were to beat Clemson, it's probably SMU Miami. There's so many different ways that this could go, but at the end of the day, I do think Clemson is going to be a team that you're going to want to watch the rest of the way. They have huge games that pretty much the rest of the season with South Carolina at the very end, so definitely one team to watch. And then a tiebreaker team is Louisville. They have a couple of huge games already behind them with Miami and SMU. They lost to them by 7 points earlier in the year, and then Clemson and Pitt later. Clemson obviously this weekend, and then Pitt a little bit later in the year. So a couple of games that I think are just going to be huge. When you talk about these conference races, it's very, very hard to get a beat on what's going to happen, on how all of this is going to break down. But at the end of the day, you do have some games to watch at the very least. And, we'll figure out all the tiebreakers and all of that craziness down the road. There's going to be a lot of craziness in the SEC in particular because there's quite a few teams that are still very much in the hunt over there. But at the end of the day, I do think those are the games you should be watching for this upcoming month. The outcomes of those will dictate a lot as we head forward, and probably in about 2 weeks, I'll be able to really unpack all of the craziness around the tiebreakers and everything and feel a lot more confident about what I'm saying. Just didn't want to get too far out ahead of myself and be saying things that never end up happening. So we'll break it down in a couple of weeks here, but definitely those are the games you want to watch in the meantime. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the players and the coaches under the most pressure as we head into this weekend, and I think you'll know the first two that I'm going to talk about.